I'm just so happy to introduce Dan to you. Probably many of you also know of his work. We come a long way back. 13 years ago, we met in Cal when his son Alex was joining the music school. And at the time I was working on learning to learn, research I was doing to see how to inspire students to learn in a way that would stay longer with them. And one of my inspirations was the work that Dan was doing that he included in his book, Mindful Brain. And that was already in 2007. And he was just talking about this beautiful resonance between the brain and the heart, and how when the two of them resonate, then we learn better. And so here we are, same same from that, other courses came where service learning has been a central part for undergraduates or older adults. And again, service, this crossing, building bridges, crossing gaps sometimes between people of different generations, cultural backgrounds, and creating that sense of continuity and union, integration. So some of the books of Dan, you probably heard of Mindsight. And then I love this one, which is just has so many information and inspiration about defining terms on neuroplasticity and interpersonal neuroplasticity and how it all works. And then he has these fabulous acronyms that you can remember about how things work. And then I have also his book, Aware, where he has this wonderful practice of the wheel of awareness. Maybe Dan is going to talk to us about that also a little bit today. And here he talks a little bit about we, but I learned this morning that he's about to give birth to another book. And this, he has many other books. He has directed the Norton collection on neurobiology and interpersonal neuroplasticity, and 70 books are there, and all kinds of very prolific author and great speaker. So do not make it too long. I know it's your time to connect with your puppy. Here is Dan, and we are just so happy him. Yes, and you too. What's your name?
This is Mendo. Hey, Mendo.
Mendo. Hey.
So she's protecting me from some ravens.
Oh, okay.
Quite sweet. Hey, Mendo, come here.
So it's also part of we, right? All sentient
beings. She is, and the ravens too. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me here, Amelia, and it's a pleasure to meet everyone. And probably if you meet her, you'll see it's hard to say no to this little cutie pie. Come here. She'll be preoccupied with a bone. So it's great to be here with you. And what I'd love to do is talk to you a little bit about things that would allow us to have a discussion. And if she's not quiet soon, 1 second. Let me just...
Yeah, pets are amazing, and they are really important, always, and especially now in this time of pandemic and all that. Many people have found relief in having nearby a pet so that they can express and receive uncomplicated love. My son did once a documentary, lovely, called "Does My Dog Think?" Here, does Mendo think?
Mendo thinks a lot.
Mendo thinks a lot too.
Everybody.
Yes.
Talk to them now.
Hello.
She's just discovered her bark. She's only 4 months old. She's just discovered her bark.
Fabulous.
I think she'll be fine now. Let's see.
Okay.
Otherwise, I'll go inside.
Okay.
So I'd love to talk to you about some things. And Amelia, you're bringing up some of the practical ways that we can approach the times we're in, and all the different work that you're doing to try to bring well-being into the world there are some, I think, foundational concepts about health, about the mind, about ways you can engage your focus of attention with awareness to create just unbelievably fascinating and important shifts in how your body constructs the molecules of well-being, and also to see how it can change the nervous system. And at the same time, these things you can train your mind to do can shift a sense of self toward, in many ways, what's a more healthful way of living for your individual life, and also collectively how we come to live on the planet. So it's kind of remarkable how the teachings of probably most indigenous cultures that I've heard about, as well as contemplative wisdom from meditative practices across the globe, have come to very common principles of living that are in contrast to the way modern culture, especially in countries like the United States, have encouraged separation and disconnection and an individualistic approach. So when we talk about how the mind constructs culture, we can see that the mind going down a certain path is not only unhelpful for the individual's mind that's participating in that culture, it becomes unhelpful for people across all levels of society, and even other organisms, plants and animals, that suffer because of certain tendencies of the human mind. So my own journey has been to deeply explore notions about the mind, about what the mind is and what a healthy mind might be, and then to think about actions we can take that can promote well-being, not only for individuals and couples and families, but for schools and institutions, for communities, and even when you think about the ecosystem, for our larger ecosystems in which we live. So whatever you'd like to do, Amelia, in terms of how to present this, I can go through some of those findings. We can open it up for questions from you or from discussion from the group. I'm here for you in whatever way that would be most useful and engaging for you.
Thank you so much. I think we could start with the discussion of, you say often the mind, how to use the mind to change the brain, to change the mind. And I think that totally fits with what we are trying to do in this course of cultivating positive neuroplasticity on a daily basis. So could you talk a little bit more about how is that dynamic of the resonance in the structure of the brain according to how we, the flow of information, the relationships, the reflection. Yeah.
Sure. Well, the first thing to say is that, we've had about 2,500 years of people saying that the mind, at least in terms of modern medicine, saying the mind is simply brain activity. Mm-hmm. And if a sense of who you are, your identity and how you belong is constructed by the mind, what that means is that everything is centered around the body, and the self is constructed from these mental processes that are both construed or contained within the networks in the brain that we can talk about, but also profoundly contained within our relational communication in families, in schools, in communities, in the larger culture. And now we have this global internet where people are, interconnected in terms of information patterns they're being shared across the planet in ways that have never happened before. These are rapid shapings of kind of a global culture, if you will, which is not going in a particularly good direction. So, so then you could say, well, all right, what's the problem with saying the mind is just in the brain? And the problem with that is that, as William James said in 1890, the grandfather of modern psychology, that's so obvious, we'll just go along with that. But while it may be part of the story of what the mind is, it's only one part of a much bigger story.
Sorry, Dan. Yeah. I thought that James also had paid a lot of emphasis on the education of attention. So not so much like the mind being produced from the brain, just an structure, but almost like the mind being a wave or a potentiality that depends how you, is more like a verb, right? It's more like, it depends how you train your attention and you observe what is being triggered, how you respond. So I got a little bit lost there. Could you please explain?
Certainly the issues like attention and memory and even religious experience, but it was all premised on the idea that all of that is brain activity. And so it was a very individual-centered approach. Even with the focus of attention, it's still, the individual doing this. So in contrast to anthropologists like Bateson, for example, who would see mind as, this social experience that we share, Bateson didn't go particularly inward or didn't seem to care much about the brain. So the question is, how could something like the mind be what James was saying, an individual's thing that was happening in the brain, or as Bateson would say, it was happening in culture. So the short response to that question, how could they be both right, is when you look at energy and information flow, it's what James was talking about. It's what Bateson was talking about, even though they didn't use those terms. It's really looking for what E.O. Wilson might call consilience, the common ground across independent ways of knowing. So I say all that because, we've gotten ourselves as a humanity into deep trouble. And the question now in 2021 is, what are we to do? And it's not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but the pandemic has made us realize what some people have realized for quite some time, racism and social injustice are profound assaults on well-being for the whole society, not just those who are marginalized. Misinformation and polarization have been intensifying, with the internet having groups of viral separated information pockets, and then we have environmental destruction, which, now we're having massive fires, of course, in California and all around the West, and huge hurricanes in the East, just in the United States alone. But the whole planet is experiencing this realization of what people have been saying for quite some time. And so you can look at the science of that and say it's the human mind that has created the conditions upon which human commercialism could be so blind to its effects on other species and ecological environments. So all of that is just basically saying that we're at a critical moment in the evolution of life on Earth to ask the question, what has happened and what can we do, if anything, about it, right? And whatever, level we work at that, we could be working in a neighborhood, trying to create more well-being in our neighborhood. We could be parents with a little baby at home. We could be, people teaching in a school. You could be working, volunteering in a community center. You could be working with the aged. You could be running an organization. All sorts of things we do that may seem big or small. And she's so learning to be protective. One second.
So while Dan takes care of Mendo, I think Dan can.
There we go. Let's see.
Okay.
She's I may just go inside, but then
I think probably it's a good idea, Dan.
let's just see if she'll. This is actually a new thing that's just started today.
Oh, to discover expressing her voice.
So
let
me move you. I'm going to move you inside and then see if she can just be quiet, because if she barks a lot, I'll have to come get her anyway. So let's just see if she can calm down.
Okay.
1 second.
Yeah. So I'm going to continue talking to the group, and I welcome this moment to reflect that yes, the pandemic has showed us how interconnected we are, and many other factors that are happening, like the climate crisis and all that, is also showing us we do need to work together. The good news is that we can bring our expertise, instead of thinking of individual expertise, that we can come back and collaborate, with each other and with other groups that we usually don't collaborate, to create this path forward. And every little action counts. In fact, the change comes from the individuals taking whatever initiative inwardly or also interpersonally. That's where the change is planted and seeded, and the only change that can happen. Because if we think just in very big terms, how can I be cultivating meditation when there is still war going on, or don't I care for all the other things? Of course you care, but then how can you change that situation? What the only thing that you have direct control on or direct influence in is you and your group and your daily life. So I think in that sense, that's the bad news. And the good news is that we have a choice, and that's the good news. The bad news is that there is a lot of work to do, but it's also an inspiration, it's an opportunity. Okay, and here we have Dan back with us.
Sorry about that.
No, this is okay. We were talking about how the good news and the bad news. The bad news is that there is a lot of work to do. The good news is that that we can do it. That we can start by working in ourselves and also working in groups, and that every little action counts. And that the humanity has gone through, different kinds of crisis, and from 2,500 years old, from classical yoga, from whatever, they always had said, the problem comes from this illusion, this identification with an individual self. And Buddhism says the same, China, all the old traditions, ancient traditions in America, in Latin America, everywhere, they all point to the fact that we are not separate, that when we are harming another person or when we are harming the planet, we are harming ourselves. That this, yoga, the second sutra of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is, yoga is a cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. And the third sutra is so that the observer doesn't confuse itself what is being observed, so that it doesn't identify like a separate self, like an individual separate self. So I'm so glad that we are coming back and putting science in the service of ancient wisdom, and that we are finding practical ways and approaches so that more people can open up to these experiences, right?
Yeah, well, it's a really interesting journey to start talking about the notion of what the self is and what the next steps might be. So, in my own experience, not being trained in contemplative practices directly, but teaching with people in that tradition, and not being someone of an indigenous culture, but of learning from people who are indigenous elders in different cultures. There's a moment now where we can say, okay, well, has modern thinking, and I used to say the word Western, and I once presented this to His Holiness the Dalai Lama at a meeting we were both teaching at, and he really pushed back hard on me and said, do not call that Western. That's all over the planet now.
Right.
And it's wrong to call it Western. So it may have been derived from European sources, and it certainly might be, understandably referred to as Western, but we should consider that it is a modern kind of view. And the modern view would be then of a separate self. And you can see things that are so embedded in our culture that we sometimes don't even question whether the self is in your body. So if there are 21 of us here on this screen, we say, there are 21 selves that are here. So in my teaching just a bit with people like the Dalai Lama and scholars like Jack Kornfield about Buddhist teaching, I've had the opportunity to learn from them about a Buddhist approach to the self. And even in that approach, there's some interesting differences and discussions about whether the self is, in some people's point of view, an illusion that needs to be dissolved. Other people would call it a delusion, which is a psychotic belief, not just an illusion, which is a misperception. And others would say that any narrative about a self is a false narrative because the self doesn't exist. So
right.
those
they talk about these 5 skandhas, these 5 little groups of sensation, emotions, actions, and that have some effect. And and then they talk about the no self, like no separate self, right? Not independent self. So it's just very interesting the different ways they explain the subject of self.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. And, as myself learning about that after I was trained to be a psychiatrist, where I felt almost to the other extreme that psychiatry was locating the self in the brain. And then it was, one of the teachings was your genes were off that made your neurons off. And then you had to give these pills to correct the imbalances, which no one had ever proven were there. And it was all seemed like a bunch of simplistic, in a sense, misguided reductionism that really wasn't helping that many people, which it wasn't actually. So psychiatry at the other extreme was saying, yeah, there is a self and the self is your brain. And so, that's the deal. And that also seemed pretty extreme. So what was fascinating then when I became an attachment researcher was to embed the self in relationships, and then to, in a way, push back on where my field was going back in the 1980s, which was to say, that the mind is just the brain's activity. And then in the 90s, the decade of the brain, to participate in, with some of my colleagues in an all-out effort to fight against the reductionism of psychiatry's dominance in the field of mental health. That's where this series of books, we now have over 80 textbooks. It's the largest mental health series in the world. And our stance is the mind is not the brain. And that really makes some straightforward neuroscientists really agitated. And we say it's more than the brain. It's not that it doesn't include the brain. And so then you can say, well, what is it? So when we're talking about energy and information flow, just following the line of scientific reasoning, you then realize that skull nor skin are impermeable boundaries from which that flow comes through. And then again, this is before I got exposed to people like Jack or the Dalai Lama, or even people teaching indigenous teachings, that flow is a part of what in mathematics we call a system. In the 1980s, a number of scientists, including mathematicians, started studying certain systems that had the qualities of being open and capable of being chaotic, and what's called nonlinear, meaning a small input led to large and very difficult to predict results. And when those three features are present, it's called a complex system. And complex systems have something called emergence. Right. So, in reading about this in the late 80s, it felt like there was something there, even though it was math, that could inform both the embodied and especially embrained and skulled part of the brain, the mind. And then you would also understand the relational aspect of the mind if you could take like what Bateson said and say he was talking about relational systems, and what the brain scientists, like a number of the people publishing things in the late 80s and early 90s, when we can look under the skull, were saying about the brain. Then you could say, well, energy and information flow is what the system is made of. But then, and this became, I think, awkward for a number of people who committed their careers to this, then you would say that you can't just put a human being in a brain scanner and saying you're picturing their mind. That's actually an error. But
okay, so let me stop you just for a moment to try to decodify this in what I'm hearing, and perhaps also making a bridge to our students. So you are talking about, if I'm understanding correctly, and please correct me if I'm not, that you're talking about two different ways to go beyond the understanding that the mind would be at the brain. On the one hand, that is not just the brain, it's the whole system of the organism, also with the heart and the guts, and so not just taking the structure of the brain, but the whole embodiment. And on the other hand, you're also saying, adding that at the same time, it goes beyond the bag of skin and is relational. So it keeps resonating, and that there is, in that resonating, there is a lot of potentiality that then can come manifest in a particular way. So for example, when we are relating to our mentors or our family or our child or even to our dog, there are different ways that we can respond, and then how we respond instead of reacting, that creates also something, new grooves in our brain for more of that same action. Is that more or less what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly, Amelia. That's right. And just to build on what you're beautifully saying, when you talk about the it, and this is, I think, the biggest challenge as an educator for me over these last 3 decades in teaching about it, is that the it is something that in my training as a biology student, or my training in medicine, or my training in psychiatry, no one ever talked about what I'm about to say. And even when I had 18 interns work with me to revise The Developing Mind into its 3rd edition, this graduate school textbook, they couldn't find anyone who was talking like this. So what
it meaning the mind.
No, but I haven't said what the it is yet.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because you said it is this, it is that, it is this, because
okay. So it could be the self, it could be, who we really are. That
well, to be very specific, in English, we have a term called mind, right? In some languages, they don't have the word, like in French, there's no word for mind. In Hebrew, there's no word for mind. We, in English and Spanish, we have these, some languages we have a word for mind, meaning what? What does it mean? Well, in academic terms, psychology, the ology is the study of, and the psyche is the spirit, the intellect, and the mind, and so psychology is the study of the mind. Well, okay, fine, that's the academic field. In medicine, the branch of medicine devoted to the mind is psychiatry, my field. Well, I'm trained in both fields. So when I became a psychological researcher, I had psychology professors as my mentors, right? So I was once with one of my favorite mentors, who was like one of the most senior psychology professors in the world. And we were at teaching at a conference together. We had dinner, and I asked him, he's, I think, 83 at the time, 84. And I said, share with us, if you will, what your definition of the mind is. And he paused. He goes, what do you mean? I said, well, you're like one of the most esteemed professors of psychology. So, it's the study of the mind. What does your field, or even you, say the mind is? And he paused and he said, I don't have a definition, and my field does not have a definition. And I had asked so many professors of psychology that, and I got the exact same response. And the same is true of psychiatry. And amazingly, the same is true with a field called philosophy of mind. Not only do they not say what that mind is, they tell you, they meaning the many professors of the philosophy of mind that are my colleagues, I've asked them, they say you should never define what the mind is. So
Why?
What the philosophers say is that once you define something, you limit your understanding. So better not define it. Well, what I said to them is, I'm a psychotherapist practicing psychiatry. So I'm a medical profession focusing on the mind. I'm a therapist of the mind. So for me to have a client, a patient coming in saying, help me with my mind. And I said, then they say, well, what's the mind, Dan? And I said, I don't know. I mean, it'd be like going to, I don't know, a carpenter who didn't know what wood was, or a lawyer who didn't know what a law was. So this is what was coming up in the late 80s for me. It was really disturbing. It was almost like that story of the emperor in the new clothes, that there was a field saying it was a specialist in the mind that would not say what the mind is, still doesn't. So anyway, what happened in the early 90s when I was asked to be a director of education for child and adolescent psychiatry at UCLA was, I said, I'm not going to continue this sham.
I must tell you that we have several psychologists here.
Okay, good. Well, let's have a discussion. I'm happy to talk about it. I've been talking about this for 30 years.
Later. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I asked 100,000 mental health professionals this question. And of course, there are descriptions of the mind, emotions, attention, consciousness, thought, all that stuff. Of course, there are lots of descriptions. But then when you say, what's a thought? What is attention? Then nothing comes up. It's been, I mean, if I had just started this a week ago, I would be just more confused by it. Now it's just like, it's almost like a joke. I mean, this has been 30 years of asking professors of psychology, psychiatry, philosophy, all this stuff. So I even had the opportunity to be with this revered Buddhist teacher and asked him what the mind was, and he couldn't give me an answer.
But I
think it's just fascinating. So maybe there's no such thing.
So probably there is a difference of context here. The psychologist is coming from one context, the Buddhist coming from another context. Is it because the mind is not a noun but a verb? Is minding? Is some function that happens through the whole being, or
yeah, good. So let's go with that, Amelia. So what is happening through the whole being?
Right. So
no, but go ahead.
According to Dan Siegel, it's a flow of energy and information.
Right. Well, this is the weird thing. This is so in looking at the mathematics of complex systems, there's something called emergence. And emergence is a documented feature of these systems, which, Buckminster Fuller talked about a little earlier than the complexity theorists, but, and he used the word synergy, that something arises that is greater than the sum of its parts. So it's a really simple proposal. It's incredibly simple. That doesn't make it accurate, and I've been for 30 years trying to find somebody to disprove this. But all I can find is, support for it. But the idea is that the mind is an emergent aspect of energy flow. And that energy flow happens inside the skull, of course it does. And it happens inside the whole body, and it happens inside the systems in which we live. Cultural systems, family systems, systems on the whole planet, ecosystems, right? So then you can then look deeply at what energy is. And for the life of me, even to this day, I try to find other, like-minded people, even people who write my series. They will not talk about energy for some reason. So it could be completely wrong. So I want to be really clear. This proposal that the mind is an emergent aspect of energy flow, and that some energy flow has symbolic value that we call information, it could be completely wrong.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it could be completely wrong because no one gathers around it. I've been talking about it for 30 years. No one says, oh yeah, that's it. So it could be wrong. And when I presented it to this professor, what I'm about to describe to you, we were riding on the trolley cars in San Francisco. At the end of the ride, with all these people gathered around, he stopped and he said, your definition of mind, which I've never heard of before, fits with my entire career in the field of psychology. And everyone was clapping, because it was this incredible moment where he was open to thinking about it, because, complex systems have emergent properties. And one of those emergent properties is called self-organization. And when you look at the mathematics of self-organization, you find that when a complex system is having differentiated components that then become connected or linked, and in that linkage, there's interdependence created, then the emergent property of adaptation and learning, that's called self-organization, arises. And when that self-organizational drive of the complex system is thwarted by either blocking diversity, blocking differentiation, or blocking connection, blocking linkage, it either goes to chaos or rigidity. So that, back in the early 90s, was the proposal of why every psychiatric disorder, without exception, can be reconsidered as examples of symptoms of chaos or symptoms of rigidity. And then the proposal was and is, that every psychiatric disorder would reveal, if you could look in the brain, for example, or look at the relational world, impaired integration. And that turns out to be true. And then later studies would show that when you look at every measure of well-being, it is predicted by how integrated the brain is. So integration, which comes from, that word is something we're using just as a common English language word, but by linking differentiated parts, we're going to call that integration. By identifying integration as the fundamental way optimal self-organization arises, this is what explains well-being, which is flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, and stable. And then impairments to integration lead to the opposite of that, which is ultimately chaos and rigidity. And that's the whole thing right there. So environmental destruction is an example of impaired differentiation and linkage, impaired integration, because humans are excessively differentiated from nature. They don't respect nature. They can build a factory and just destroy the environment around it. They don't think about the long-term implications of the junk that we produce. So we're excessively differentiated. And so integration is off, and chaos and rigidity are ensuing. Racism is an outcome of impaired integration of humanity. And in families, abuse and neglect is impaired integration. And, abuse and neglect is one example. What happens in the brain when someone has abuse or neglect is their brain loses its integrative growth, and the child is prone to chaos or rigidity. And amazingly, if you look at what mindfulness meditation does, if you had an elevator speech you had to give, you would say it integrates the brain. Right. So this is where, whether it's inside the brain or the brain and the whole body or relationally, integration as the source of health has upheld, at least the last 30 years, trying to disprove it. So I wouldn't want to say it's true, but so far there's a lot of evidence to support that. And we haven't found any evidence to go against it, that the mechanism of well-being in any complex system is integration.
It's beautiful. I mean, I
So
love
that's
these
it.
components of the differentiation on the one hand, so that every part can have its own identity, if you will, and then the linkage, which is totally present also in we, right? So you have the differentiation, me, you, each, and then but the linkage, the remembering that really we are one spirit.
Right. And this is,
and then the integration. I love the way you put it,
Well, and Amelia, the integration is interesting because, we want to be careful of not going to one extreme or the other. So originally, before the word we was kind of created out of necessity, I was giving a talk called Me to We. And one of my students, who happened to be from the Lakota Nation, she came up to me at the workshop and said, "I'm so angry with you." And I said, "Why are you angry?" She goes, "Your title of your talk is you're being a hypocrite. You're going completely against everything you've taught." I said, well, "How's it a hypocrite?" She goes, "Me to we implies dropping me and only doing we." And I said, "You're absolutely right, but that's not what I mean." She goes, "Well, you're not saying what you mean." She goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, what I mean is not only me, but also we." And she looks at me, she goes, "That doesn't rhyme." So I said, "Okay, then how about if you're going to integrate me and we, how about me plus we is we?" And she was very excited about it, as I was. And what's been fascinating about it is one of my students did his PhD dissertation on Ubuntu, which I was so excited, which is the South African way of life that is translated often as "I am because we are." Right. So I was so excited to have him come into this group I was helping facilitate. And I said, "This is great. Ubuntu is integration." He goes, "It's absolutely not integration." I said, "No." I said, "Come on, I am because we are." He goes, "Well, that's the whole point. It's only about collectivism." And he goes, "Other writers may write differently, but I've done my whole PhD on this. It's collectivism."
So is that we?
No, that's just we. That's just individuality is dispensed with. It's like my wife used to live in Japan, and we've gone to Japan. It's an incredibly collectivistic culture, and you meet someone and you say hello, and they go, "Hello, I'm a Toshiba worker," and there's kind of a loss of individuality. I mean, we met one of her former students was just the opposite, but he stood out like a sore thumb. He was all into all these fun things that made him a unique individual. But the thing we've been looking for, which we can't seem to find, is somewhere on the planet where someone's tried out an integrative identity.
Well, I'll propose you something from Gloria Ansaldúa. I don't know if you have heard of her. She is Gloria Ansaldúa. She's a Chicano-Latino writer who has written a lot about bilingualism and, just bilingual identity, the integration of, she brought the Aztec from her ancestors, plus the fact of being Chicana, about 17 generations, the frontier crossed the place where she lived, and now she was Mexican and then became somehow American when many generations before the border was moved up north. And so she first wrote a book, This Bridge Called My Back, where she and other writers, women writers of color, were talking about their experience of how it's different to be a woman if you are a woman of color than a white woman. And so differentiation within this general category of feminism. But then a few years before she died, she wrote another book called This Bridge We Call Home. And in that anthology and that particular essay where she also presented that, in the anthology there were men, women, color, not color, everyone who felt the same way was considered to be in the same bridge, maybe coming from different places, but holding this common place. And that's in a way what we are experiencing, I think, with the volunteering with the Latino students here and this intergenerational dialogue. But she has something that you would love. She took the word nosotros, in Spanish, we would be nosotros or nosotras, and she parcel it into nos and otros. And so within the we, there are the others and there are nos, but it's also one. So it's taking that differentiality that you so
beautiful
has pointed out, and then the being together. And it's just beautiful the way she keeps talking about it's important that we express our voice and that we are recognized, within the culture. Latino population in the United States is still not really recognized for the enormous force it is and the contributions it has done. But it's also very important that at the same time we keep cultivating this, this commonality.
Yeah. Well, I would love if you could send me a link to her work. I'd love to see that because it reminds me of a study done at UCLA on adolescent well-being for adolescents who were coming as first generation people in Los Angeles. Mm-hmm. And they found, kind of like what she's saying, that the ones who had the most mental health were the ones that could retain elements of their culture of origin. And as they went out and adopted, whatever American culture is, or lack of it, they didn't lose their roots. They stayed differentiated. And then in the two worlds they lived in, at family and out with their peers, they found a way to kind of, they didn't use the word integration, but to integrate it that way. And they had, in terms of their measures of well-being, they had the highest measures of well-being. And
right.
That would be an example of an integrative developmental phase. And Susan Harter also, doesn't use the word integration, but she talks about adolescence as having these multiple selves that they live in, and the way they differentiate them and link them, is also a sign of mental health. So it's a very exciting idea, and I'd love to see the use of the word too, because we're trying to collect in all over the planet these ways of doing it. In thinking about the consilience idea, consilience is E.O. Wilson's term for common findings across independent pursuits of knowledge. Two consilient findings came up. One being integration is the basis of health, from all the reasoning we just talked about. But the other was that for people to change, whether it's an individual or a child in school or a kid at home or someone in therapy or even a culture, we need to use consciousness.
Right.
So then the question came up for me was, as a therapist, what would happen if you integrated consciousness? So I tried doing that with my patients years ago. When this first kind of came up, these two ideas, consciousness is needed for change, integration is needed for health. What if you put them together in integrated consciousness? So we did that around this table where you could differentiate the components of consciousness from each other and then link them. So integration is differentiation and linkage. Consciousness is the experience of knowing and the thing that is the known. And, coming back to the self is, we're not even using the word self there, but it's just the literal subjective experience. So mind has subjectivity, consciousness, information processing, as well as self-organization. And in the subjective experience, there's the feeling of knowing, like if I say hello, I said hello, but then there's the known, which is the word hello. So consciousness of this person, Dan, saying hello, has at least two differentiatable components, the knowing and the known. And some people say, what about the knower? So let's just leave the knower aside for now. So the knowing and the known can be differentiated. In a table in the office, we have it as a center of this thing that looks like a wheel. So we call it the wheel of awareness, the hub being the knowing as a metaphor, and then the rim on the outside being the knowns. And we have 4 segments, all of them energy flow patterns. Energy flow from the outside of the body comes in as sight, as that you see, you hear, you smell, you taste, you touch. Then we go inside the body for energy flow inside the body in a second segment. Then we go to the third segment, and we allow the focus of the spoke of attention to bring in any kind of emotions or thoughts or memories, things we call mental activities. And then you move the spoke over again to a fourth segment to feel into the relationality of the body in a larger context. So we do this, and then in an advanced stage of the wheel, you do not only, as the meditation you did earlier, these loving kindness practices to build kind intention and awareness of our interconnectivity, but you actually, before that, you bend the spoke around and explore pure awareness. And I was able to do this practice with patients, and they got over anxiety, depression, fear of death, trauma. It was really quite striking. And then I started teaching to my students who were therapists mostly. And then people asked me to do workshops. So I started doing workshops. Because I'm a scientist, I brought a recorder, and then I recorded the first 10,000 people that did it. And then before the pandemic, I finished doing this wheel of awareness practice with 50,000 people live in workshops and things like that. So we got a lot of reports on what it was like. And the one thing I just want to say is that when you get to pure awareness in the hub, there was an incredibly exciting common statement that people felt not only the open awareness, which was there, but they felt profoundly connected and filled with love. And that spells an acronym, connected, open awareness, and love. Those spells the word COAL, just as a way of remembering what people said. And it sent me on this journey to try to ask the question, if it's true that the mind is an emergent property of energy, and you can explore the mind and integrate consciousness with this wheel practice and getting this data, this is what people are reporting. Is there anything in the science of energy that might give us insight into the origins of consciousness? So that led to, me working with people who are the experts in energy, which are physicists and mathematicians, and then putting together a kind of framework for how the mental experience of awareness overlaps with a physicist's view of what energy is. And I don't think we have time to go over it here, but just to say,
probably not. But it seems it would touch with quantum physics, right?
Yeah,
with the waves and then the deep sea and all of them feeling themselves like separate, but then being one.
Yeah, where you get this ability with the wheel of awareness practice, and you can read about this in Aware, or this book you're referring to, Becoming Aware, just came out, where you can learn to do the wheel, or we're at our website. You can come join us in a kind of retreat in the Redwoods. We're going to do a whole 10-hour retreat kind of thing, and then have a live Q&A that'll be recorded.
Could we have a little taste?
It would take too long to do, I think. So better to just talk, maybe take any questions. Because once you get into it, you don't want to just get into it and pop out of it.
Right.
It's
We need to invite you
too
again.
Disturbing, actually.
Yeah.
I've learned, people will say that, just do a little bit. And I said, no, I don't think so. Because
how much time do you need?
Oh, you really, to do it, you need about half an hour.
Okay.
Yeah. But so you can do it from my website. I mean, you can certainly come to this, this 3-day retreat thing we're doing over a 3-week period, but for free, you can go to my website and just do the practice, which I highly recommend. And it has embedded in it, what are called the 3 pillars of mind training that have been shown to reduce stress, to improve your immune system functioning, to improve cardiovascular functioning, to reduce inflammation by changing epigenetic controls, to actually optimize an enzyme called telomerase that repairs the ends of your chromosomes, and even to integrate your brain, which is the basis of well-being. So that's independent studies that show when you train attention, open awareness, and build kindness, you actually get these 5 physiological changes of health. and you actually change the structure of the brain toward a more integrative functioning. So the wheel has all three in one practice. And what's exciting about it is you not only get those benefits for your individual well-being, but when people learn to tap into the hub of that wheel, what's been so both fascinating and fulfilling is to hear that people have learned to shuttle back and forth between what physicists describe, this is what I think is going on, as the Newtonian realm of macro states, like you're born into a body, where we have something called the arrow of time, and there's a directionality of change in that realm. But then there's another realm that physicists have discovered, which I think indigenous people have talked about forever, which is a quantum realm, which is timeless, and the illusion of separation by time or space doesn't exist as it does in Newtonian reality. So someone who lived near Sir Isaac Newton's birthplace took me over to England, and we did the wheel of awareness around the apple tree where Newton proposed the whole idea of gravity. And so we had to pay homage to Sir Isaac, because he just didn't know that there was another realm besides what ultimately would be called the Newtonian realm. And so you'll see, we have it, I think, up on our website. A documentary filmmaker went to film this, and you'll see these meditators dropping out of the Newtonian realm and into the quantum realm through a 25-minute practice.
25 minutes. If it was 20, we could have it.
Yeah, no, but you don't want to just leave people like that.
No.
I even did this at a meditation, a 1-week meditation retreat, and I was just a scientist there, so they weren't having me teach meditation, but the students said, teach us. So I made the mistake of teaching it just like that. And then it, because when you aren't ready to shift out of the realm, it's a very mystical, Dacher Keltner, a professor at Berkeley, Dacher did the mystical experiences scale when people did the wheel of awareness, and he got the same scores as if they were on psilocybin. And interestingly, the things that clinically are treated by the wheel are exactly what these controlled substances of psychedelics are showing work.
So that's very good news.
Yeah, so a number of those psychedelic researchers are calling me because in the book Aware, there's 100 pages showing, what pure awareness likely looks like, not only in the brain, but what is happening to it in terms of energy flow experiences. And it may be that that's the mechanism, possibly, that's underlying the power of psychedelics. When I presented this, I think before he passed away, I presented this whole notion to Ram Dass before he died. And he was so excited about it because, of course, with Timothy Leary, he started using psychedelics and gave those up to then find meditation. So he was thrilled that there was like a bridge from a quantum view of the mind to see what the meditation that he had learned to do, Ram Dass, compared to what he had probably discovered using LSD with Leary back in those days. So
I have some questions for you that came from the students, and there might be some more at the chat. I mean, we are a little bit over the time that you had initially allowed us, but would you mind?
Let me make sure no one needs me right away, but I do need to go soon, I know, but go ahead. Yes, tell me the question.
One of the practices is, what is your daily practice?
The wheel of awareness.
The wheel you do
every day.
Every day.
Every day.
As soon as you wake up, when you go to sleep.
I do it when I wake up. I don't do it when I go to sleep because I'm too tired,
Right.
But I do it when I wake up, and it's amazing. It's every day is different, but it's such a well, when you listen to it, you'll see it's a very systematic exploration of kind of a pretty comprehensive array of what's going on. And then especially when you get to the advanced stage, and if you get the book Becoming Aware, it's a little manual that takes you on a 21-day journey to learn how to do the wheel. But when you learn to do it, as a daily practice, since it's basically building these 5 changes in your body of well-being. And, Elizabeth Blackburn got the Nobel Prize for discovering the telomere system, and her colleague Alyssa Epple called me when she read the book and said, "You need to say one more thing." I said, "What more do I need to say?" She said, "You need to say it slows the aging process."
Right.
So when it's improving your health and slowing the aging process, it kind of motivates you, like taking a vitamin that might do all of it. And then you're integrating your brain, which is the base of regulation. So anyway, it doesn't take much more facts to get you to be motivated to do it. But the subjective experience of doing it is a whole transformation that people have reported who've made the wheel their daily practice. And it meets the criteria if you want to do it a minimum of, a dozen minutes a day, a daily dozen, so even if you do we have a fast one, you get your daily dozen in. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There was another question about, or comment that, well, there are several ones, and also I'm not reading the chat, but I have Millie here reading the chat. But even before the class, one of our people here was saying that all these things kept her thinking of when Obama was saying, we are all interconnected, and then the Republicans said, no, we did the country on our own, we did it all alone. And again, it's another application of, are we going to really realize that we are all in the same boat, and that we need to bring our talents, our gifts to share with each other, or are we going to, practice this distancing? So it just has so many applications. I mean, it's just so timely. I love it.
Well, I think that point is really an excellent one. And, we can't do a thing where we say to someone, yeah, it's all kumbaya, we're all in this together. I think we need to have an integrated approach where we say we are both individuals. And this is where, when, I work with my dear colleagues and friends who are Buddhist, we have wonderful discussions about this. And even, the Dalai Lama himself is, I think, really open to this, that we don't need to go to the extreme of saying there is no self.
Right, no.
Because even as an attachment researcher, what the research shows is that the more you have an understanding of where your childhood experiences led you to have direct impacts on you and how you adapted also to what happened, making sense of that is the best predictor we have of how you will have children who are securely attached to you, which is the best predictor for them of their well-being. So to say there's no self, or to say that narratives are an illusion, I think is going to an extreme that I understand the philosophy of it, but it itself is a kind of dissociation, a kind of, a negation of one aspect, a differentiated aspect. You get about 100 years, if you're lucky, to live in a body. The body does have a history. If you ignore that history, the history will come back to bite you. Understanding that history frees you from the prison of the past, so that then you could say, yeah, there is a body. This body has an inner self to it that gets about 100 years to live.
Right. At some points, it gets to be almost semantics. I mean, the concept of non-self it doesn't deny that you exist, that you have a body, that you have a past. It only says there is no independent self. There is not interconnected self. In fact, that that we are all the time in process of being shaped by our own decisions and choices, and also by our own interrelations and everything. So they talk about a no fixed self. They don't deny that, that it exists. And how we work with the past and the future through the present also doesn't deny the past or the future. But yeah, I mean, how wonderful that we have you here and we can have this conversation right at home.
Absolutely. What you're saying is so beautiful, that there is a way the self is continually forming and reforming in its life. It's not fixed. Absolutely. And I think that's what Thich Nhat Hanh was trying to say about the idea of being and non-being when you hear his his beautiful book on the Heart Sutras.
Right.
And there's a quote I have of his in this book I'm just finishing up now. It's his latest book. I think it's called The Other Shore. And he says that in his creating the word interbeing,
Right.
The effort was to avoid this kind of extreme misinterpretation, in his view, of non-dualism.
Right.
You know, that even the way non-dualists often take that term, he says, is very dualistic. I'm only saying that because as we go into where to go in the future, and the question is about doing and being, this book I'm writing now, when I signed the contract to write it, the name of it was Being Mindful Doing.
Oh, wow.
That was actually the name of it. So it's exactly this question that's being asked. And so that book ended up being more expressed in the developing mind. And this book now is called Intra-Connected, but originally it was Being Mindful Doing. Because ultimately, you know, it's, and I think Roshi Joan Halifax talked about this beautifully, and she runs the Upaya Zen Center. And I had the good fortune of teaching with her a few times there and having, you know, interpersonal neurobiology meet, you know, Buddhist activism, which Joan is really a master of. But in Roshi Joan's view, you know, to just be mindful is not doing the social activism that's needed in the world. But to do that activism, in her book, I think it's called At the Edge or something like that, is this masterpiece book. But it's really looking in this deep way at how to be a social activist, you really need to do the inner work, right, of being mindful. And I just did an Instagram Live yesterday.
Plus compassion, right? Mindful plus compassion.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's a whole nother deal about what does it really mean to be mindful, exactly. But the idea of being present with focused attention, being openly aware, and having kindness as your intention, those three pillars, whether you call that mindfulness and compassion or mindfulness, those are trainable skills. And I did this Instagram Live to promote the book of Rhonda McGee, who's from San Francisco. And Professor McGee is a law professor who wrote a book called The Inner Work of Racial Justice.
Right.
And what we were talking about was exactly what this question is, is how do you actually bring this receptive, open state to the challenge of facing this mental construction of racism? Or as, you know, Isabel Wilkerson's powerful book, Caste, shows, this system of caste that obliterates people of color. So how, whether you're a white person or a person of color, how do you actually bring the strength of all those changes we talked about into your work, whether it's volunteering or working in a company or being a teacher, whatever you're doing to promote well-being? And so what Rhonda McGee and I were talking about was, you know, the inner work is, number one, building resilience, which all these things we talked about, which are embedded in the wheel, do. Number two, it's liberating yourself from the lie of the separate self, the solo self. Not saying there is no self, but realizing there's an expanded self. Right. You know, that it's a verb, not a noun. And the irony is that when you sit quietly in meditation, quote, alone, you come to dissolve that subjective experience that you're alone. That's the beauty of meditation, that if you're doing it deeply enough, you have this transformation of identity. And so that's, you know, that's the inner work for not just racial justice, but for the justice for the planet and for bringing well-being to a larger swath of living beings on Earth.
Beautiful. Yeah, you drop the fears, you drop all the separation, that really the sense of a separate self, it is a lot based also on fears. And yeah. Here there is another question, and maybe we'll close with this, although it's a question for another whole conversation. Where do you place the spirit in relation to your concept of energy?
Yeah, it's a really great question. Thank you for these and the other questions. that word spirit is very interesting, isn't it? I mean, when you look up psyche in the Webster's dictionary, soul and spirit, intellect and mind are the four, terms that it uses to try to say what psyche is. I used to teach a lot with a dear friend and colleague named John O'Donohue, who was an Irish Catholic priest and a poet and a philosopher and an Irish mystic. So it was strange. We would teach together, but we had very different backgrounds, but he would call me, we would call each other twins, and sadly he died about a dozen years ago. But John, as a priest, would use the word spirit all the time. He would use the word soul all the time. And I never use those terms, ever. And I still don't. And one time I was teaching with Hamid, with A.H. Almas, and Hamid uses the word spirit a lot. And, he has this whole diamond approach, which two of my closest friends are deeply immersed in that. And I think it's really exciting and nice and really fascinating. But in the end, when Tammy Simon was overseeing this all-day discussion between Hamid and myself, in the end, Hamid, you can watch the recording of this if you want, he says something which really shocked me. He said, science has absolutely nothing to offer for the world of spirit. And we had spent a whole day, even though I didn't use the word, showing the science that actually is incredibly conciliant with spiritual practices of all sorts, and it was an incredible moment because, there's a long story about it, but, I think there's a way we need to get around the word. So even though I don't use the word spirit, and I know indigenous practices do, and religious practices do, and is there something that is invisible to the eye, but that is extremely real? And John would call that mysticism, the belief in the reality of the invisible. Of course there is. To think that the human senses can see everything that is real would be hubris. It would be arrogance. It would be wrong. It wouldn't be scientific even, So, so when I talk deeply with my colleagues and friends who use the word spirit and say, 1 second, what do you mean by that word? Inevitably, what they really are meaning is emergence. Mm-hmm. They're saying there's something greater than the parts that's emerging from something, and it has a certain kind of set of properties to it, which is basically what the mathematics of complex systems says. So I say, wow, okay, if you're saying that synergy and emergence are what you mean by spirit, and I haven't found an exception to this yet, and I'm sure there must be someone who thinks more theistically, but this is more about spirit. You didn't say God. There is this incredible overlap, let's just put it that way, between what complex systems give rise to and what people use the word spirit for. So I just try to be true to the different fields. And in science, we don't use the word spirit, but we do have the term emergence, and we do have the term synergy. So, for me, the bridge between science and spirituality is along looking deeply at what energy flow is really all about. And then there's this incredible joining of journeys, without having to use words that, when they're not defined, they just have a quality that I don't know how we can communicate when they're not defined.
Right. So energy, we could also talk about love there as that compassion, as that kind of intangible, deeper essence. You even have the beautiful sentence about integration is embodied compassion, or
integration and kindness, or integration made visible. Totally.
It seems to me that all the older traditions and the most recent discoveries from neuroscience and the science of well-being, the science of meditation, all of them end up in this that I think you reflect also so well in the concept of we, that our essence is love, is interconnectedness, and that's the one spirit, if you like, that we are all together, the deep sea of which we are all waves that, somehow have the impression of being different, but
Yeah,
they all
beautiful.
are coming to the deep. So sometimes I think words, sometimes people get a little bit separated by that, but I think we are all longing and pointing to very similar spaces, and
Exactly.
probably the
Exactly.
same space under different lenses.
Right. Well, I think you're absolutely right. I think words can limit us and they can liberate us both. And I think this is really literally where we are at as a humanity, is how do we find the love, the spirit that you're talking about so beautifully, Amelia, and find a common language.
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you.
Thank you.
It has been wonderful. And
Thank you,
all
everyone.
of you for your questions, for your comments.
Yeah,
what is
exactly.
a workshop called for learning the wheel?
Oh, yeah. It's called Aware. And if you go to our website, mindsightinstitute.com, or then after dansiegel.com, you'll find it. We're starting in about 2 weeks. Please come join us for that. I think you'll find a community of people going deeply into, you'll get into the physics of all this, and that opens up a whole bridge across all these different fields we're talking about.
Fabulous. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you.
And Mendo thanks you too. She's gotten up from her nap.
Yes, good. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Be well.
Thank you.